Does God exist? This question can answer the deepest questions in life. But how do we find the answer? Well, today we will be hosting a hypothetical court case, with the evidence presented being biblical prophecy in the book of Daniel. The argument is as follows: secular scholars and other non-Christians argue that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, while Christians argue the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC. Because the book of Daniel contains prophecy, if proven to be written before the events prophesied, then the question of accurate and specific predictive prophecy existing in the book of Daniel must be answered. And the only logical explanation for the book of Daniel's prophecy would be the Abrahamic God existing and the book of Daniel accurately describing him. However, if Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC and the book is not authentic, this would mean the book of Daniel, which itself says was written in the 6th century BC, would be wrong, and because of this the Bible would be wrong and therefore Christianity could not be true. The book of Daniel is also incompatible with Islam and Judaism, due to chapter 9, which states that the Messiah would die unlike what Muslims believe, and that there would a period of 69 sevens from the restoration of Jerusalem to the anointing Messiah, who still has not come according to Orthodox Jews. To simplify the argument, if Daniel was written in the 6th century BC, what logically follows is that Christianity is true, but what logically follows if Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC is that Christianity is not true. Hopefully you now understand the extreme importance of this court case and how it could answer some of the most important questions in our lives. Now let us begin. The first piece of evidence to be reviewed are the earliest copies and references to Daniel. Atheists theorize that the book of Daniel was written between 167 and 164 BC, with Antiochus Epiphanes being the person prophesied in verses 11, 40 to 45, which atheists believe are failed predictions of what he would do. The oldest fragments from the book of Daniel are dated to roughly 125 BC, within 50 years of when atheists date its composition. Because of the relative abundance of fragments of the book of Daniel, we know that the book was canonized at this time by the Qumran community, the Essenes. A canonization of the book within 50 years of the book being written is extremely unlikely, and along with this, Jewish tradition firmly supports the book being written in the 6th century BC instead of the 2nd century BC. Because the Essenes had isolated themselves from the rest of the Jews around 150 BC, however, this places the canonization of the book within 20 years of when it was written, since the Essenes would have had to take the book of Daniel with them when they isolated themselves. For the book of Daniel to be canonized within 20 years of the book being written is extremely unlikely, but even if it was, because the Essenes disputed with the Maccabees over Jewish customs, it would be highly unlikely for the Essenes to accept the book of Daniel, which was written by the Maccabees and in their lifetime, which they would know had been written in their lifetimes and was not a real prophetic book. So ultimately the earliest copies and references to the book of Daniel strongly support that the book was not written when atheists believe, but much earlier. Now for the next piece of evidence to be reviewed, the language and linguistics of the book of Daniel. Interestingly, around half of the book is written in official Aramaic, which was used from the 7th to 3rd centuries BC, and the other half of the book is written in Hebrew. This makes sense if the book was written by a bilingual Jewish exile living in Babylon, but does not make sense at all if the book was written in the 2nd century BC during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. It should also be noted that during the Hasmonean dynasty period there was a Hebrew Renaissance where Hebrew was becoming extra prominent again, and it is unlikely the Maccabees would have written and canonized a book written in Aramaic. The Hebrew contained within the book of Daniel also matches biblical Hebrew from the 6th century BC, but not Mishnaic Hebrew, which was used in the 2nd century BC. The style of the book of Daniel indicates that it was written in the Babylonian and Persian period rather than the Hellenistic period of Israel. It should also be noted that the language and style used in Daniel chapter 4, which was supposedly written by Nebuchadnezzar, matches very well with the language and style used by him in Babylonian inscriptions. A specific word used in the book of Daniel for Chaldean differs from the rest of the Bible. According to secular scholars, it supposedly has Greek influence, suggesting the book was written in the Hellenistic period. However, this word for Chaldean combines the Aramaic terms Kasti for the people of Chaldea and Chaldee for astrologers. This phonetic shift is plausible for a 6th century author living in Babylon, but an unlikely occurrence for a 2nd century author in Palestine. The Book of Daniel has many loanwords used that are from other languages. The most used loanwords are from the Akkadian language, but these loanwords were used in the 2nd and 6th centuries BC and therefore do not support an early or late date for the Book of Daniel. The Persian loanwords in the Book of Daniel were thought to be evidence for the later date of the Book of Daniel. However, now with more artifacts being discovered and a better understanding of the Persian language, the Persian loanwords are presumed to be Old Persian loanwords, with Old Persian being used from 900 to 300 BC, but not in the 2nd century BC as secular scholars suggest was the time Daniel written. Still used as evidence for the Book of Daniel being written in the 2nd century BC is the 3 Greek loanwords contained in Daniel chapter 3 and used for instruments. However, the Aramaic documents of Elephantine, dated to the 5th century BC, suggest that Greek loanwords were in use during the far before the Hellenistic period, and therefore the Greek loanwords in the Book of Daniel do not necessarily suggest a late date for the book. However, ultimately only 3 Greek loanwords suggests rather that the Book of Daniel was not written in the 2nd century BC, since there was far more Hellenistic influence on Israel during this time, and it does not make sense for there to be so little Greek loanwords, especially compared to Old Persian loanwords. Ultimately, the language and linguistics of the Book of Daniel favor the early date of the book's composition. Another piece of evidence that is suggested to support the late date for the Book of Daniel is where the Book of Daniel is placed within the Jewish canon. Daniel is included in the writings section rather than the prophets section, which secular scholars suggest is because they knew that Daniel was not a prophetic book. However, the earliest attestation to the placement of Daniel in the Jewish canon is from Josephus, and he places the book in the prophets section. The reason for the Book of Daniel being later transferred to the writings section was because the first 6 chapters of Daniel focuses more on stories instead of prophecy. And because Daniel was never called a prophet in his book, but instead had a unique role that included prophesying similar to Joseph in the book of Genesis. So, the canonicity of the Book of Daniel does not favor an early or late date of writing. The next piece of evidence to be reviewed is the historical accuracy of the Book of Daniel. Secular scholars claim that the book has multiple historical inaccuracies that suggest the Book of Daniel was written well after the Babylonian and Persian periods and that it is not infallible. The first is a supposed contradiction between Daniel 1:5, which records that Daniel and his friends were promoted after they had been taken captive for 3 years, and 2:1, which states that Daniel was promoted supposedly to a higher position in Nebuchadnezzar's 2nd year. Some may argue the promotion in Daniel 1 was really lesser than the promotion in Daniel 2, or Daniel's testing was still continued despite his promotion. However, there is a simpler solution. The Old Greek Septuagint text for Daniel has the events of Daniel 2 take place in Nebuchadnezzar's 12th year instead of his 2nd, and the reason why the Masoretic text says the 2nd year is due to scribal error. The Book of Daniel also supposedly states that Nebuchadnezzar was the father of Belshazzar, which contradicts modern archaeology. The reason for this can be explained by the Hebrew word used, which can also mean grandfather, ancestor, or predecessor, all of which Nebuchadnezzar was. And the reverse applies to the word usually used to call Belshazzar Nebuchadnezzar's son. Secular scholars also argue that Belshazzar was not king of Babylon. However, is accepted that he co-ruled with Nabonidus, and because he had been controlling Babylon while Nabonidus was away, it makes sense Daniel called him king. The siege recorded in Daniel 1:1 is also somewhat disputed. However, Babylonian records confirm that Nebuchadnezzar took tribute from the Levant region in his ascension year, and if Daniel used ascension years, this places the date of the siege in Nebuchadnezzar's ascension year. Many secular scholars also propose that Darius the Mede never existed, and the author of Daniel either got Darius the First confused or made Darius the Mede up. However, it is very likely that Darius the Mede is either Gobryas, the Persian general who captured Babylon and became governor of the province and would notably be 62 at the time like Darius the Mede. Or Darius the Mede is Cyaxares II, the supposed king of Media, while Cyrus was the king of Persia in the Achaemenid Empire. After his death Cyrus would simply unite the empire. The age of Cyaxares II when Babylon was taken is not known, but Xenophon records him to be an old man, which makes sense if he were 62. Possibly the biggest historical objection to the book of Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar's 7-year period of mania. However, it's possible that the period wasn't 7 years, since the Hebrew word the period is for periods of time and not necessarily years. There are not many records about the late reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and so Nebuchadnezzar could have humbled himself before God before he died. It also possibly that his period of mania was 7 years, though, because of the lack of information on his late reign. If the Babylonian fragment BM 33041 doesn't actually reference an invasion of Egypt as some suggest, then this would mean there would be over a 7-year gap when it came to information about Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And if revised chronology is correct and the 26th and 27th Egyptian dynasties overlapped, this would greatly explain why the pharaoh Taharqa recorded he had conquered the Levant, since he would have ruled during Nebuchadnezzar's exile. A piece of evidence supporting the Babylonian exile is that Eusebius, a 4th century historian, quotes that a Greek historian, Megasthenes, who records that Nebuchadnezzar had been possessed by some god and was foretold of a great calamity, which makes sense if this was a warped version of Daniel chapter 4. And a Babylonian inscription narrated by Nebuchadnezzar's son notes that Nebuchadnezzar was undergoing strange behavior and was not concerned about Babylon but was praying to the Lord of Lords. Now that the historical evidence against Daniel has been overviewed, let us present the positive historical evidence for the book of Daniel that suggests that the author of Daniel was knowledgeable of 6th century BC history. One such was Belshazzar, who was believed to be a fictional king of the Babylonians since he was only recorded by Xenophon. However, Babylonian inscriptions found confirmed he existed and that he co-ruled with his father Nabonidus. It is very unlikely that without the book of Daniel someone living in the 2nd century BC would know about him. Daniel also recorded that Babylon was quickly taken by surprise, which Herodotus also records. Daniel was also able to give an accurate and specific description of the diplomatic relations between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires starting from their beginnings up to the Maccabean revolt, when Israel became independent. Daniel also records that Nebuchadnezzar was the builder of New Babylon, which Greek historians misattributed to other figures. So ultimately the historical accuracy of Daniel favors the early date of writing. Now the final piece of evidence to be overviewed is the interpretation of Daniel's prophecy and whether it better fits a hoax written in the 2nd century BC or whether it's authentic and written in the 6th century BC. Atheists believe that chapter 11 verses 36 to 45 talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, while Christians believe they refer to a future king. Interestingly though, verse 11:41 says this king would invade Israel, which Antiochus already owned, suggesting that this was a future king. Daniel chapter 2 also does not fit well with the atheist interpretation that the book was written in the 2nd century, since Daniel prophesied 4 kingdoms after Babylon. The Roman Empire could not be the 4th kingdom in the atheist interpretation, so atheists must split the Medo-Persian Empire into Media and Persia, which does not make sense since Daniel clearly states the kingdoms must come after each other, which Media and Persia didn't since they were part of the same kingdom. The little horn of the 4th beast in Daniel chapter 7 also does not fit the atheist interpretation since the book describes the horn uprooting 3 of the 10, however Antiochus Epiphanes did not uproot 3 kings. Atheists also argue it doesn't make sense for the author of Daniel to skip 2,000 years of history from Antiochus to the Antichrist, but Antiochus Epiphanes the Maccabean revolt would be successful, and Israel would gain its independence, meaning the relations between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires were no longer important to the Israelites. It also makes sense for Daniel to use Antiochus Epiphanes to foreshadow the future Antichrist due to the similarities between them. However, it does not make sense for a 2nd century BC writer to record history as prophecy for a type of hoax but also make predictions about what Antiochus Epiphanes would do, since there would be no incentive. Along with all this, Daniel chapter 9 poses a large problem to the atheist interpretation since it has many prophecies that would be fulfilled after the 2nd century BC, such as the Messiah, the Jerusalem, and the temple being completely destroyed and the prophecy of 77s. It does not make any sense for a 2nd century author who thought that the end of times were coming soon to try and predict that the Messiah was going to come, be anointed, and killed, and that the temple and city would be completely destroyed, and even less sense for all these predictions to come true. Daniel also prophesied that there would be 77s from a decree to restore Jerusalem to the anointing of the Messiah. Starting from Artaxerxes' decree in 458 BC, the end date would be around 27 AD, a plausible date for the baptism of Jesus. Jesus would also be crucified plausibly in 30 AD, the middle of the final week, which many Christians believe fulfilled the prophecy of abolishing the daily sacrifice in the middle of the final week. Ultimately, for the author of Daniel to make such a prediction and then for it come to true is extremely unlikely and suggests that biblical prophecy really does exist, and the book of Daniel is authentic. So, the interpretation of Daniel's prophecy suggests that the book of Daniel is authentic and written in the 6th century BC. As we can see, based on the evidence we have reviewed, the evidence strongly supports that the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC and the prophecy is authentic. So, in our hypothetical court case, this evidence has deemed a verdict that the book of Daniel is authentic and written in the 6th century BC and can be used as evidence for Christianity. Now that is all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day and goodbye.